pranina swekukarmashu tam vande paramatmanam swatmanam sharvadena.
On the riverbank, pilgrim guides tell of the deeds of Shiva on earth to religious tourists from all over India. As early as the first millennium BC, the Mahabharata visualized India as one motherland, united through pilgrimage. And this vast and continuous recirculation of money, people and ideas is what has given India the unity which it never had in politics until the British came.
So you've been to Bajnath. Bajnath you have been.
These men are typical of the thousands here today. Poor agricultural labourers from a village near Kasambi. In the last few days, they've travelled by bus a 2,000-mile round trip, visiting shrines high up into the Himalayas. They've spent their entire savings for the year. We do it, they say simply, because our ancestors did it.
The rich are here too. This is the Maharaja of Benares. He's revered by many as the living representative of Shiva on earth. At the heart of the sacred city is a labyrinth of narrow alleys. In the very centre is a small Shiva temple viewed by the pilgrims as the most sacred in India. It's the goal of everyone tonight, bearing their pots of Ganges water. In the inner sanctum, the simple black stone is submerged with offerings of milk and flowers. These ancient rituals connect the worshippers with their deity, but also their history, their myths, and their deepest racial memories. Western civilization saw one God who stood outside his creation. India saw numberless aspects of the same divinity, unity and diversity. Each was a vision deeply rooted in the distinctive character of its own civilization. Away from the gaudy tumult of Benares, in about 500 BC, a young Indian prince preached a sermon which would change the world. His name was Gautam, and we know him as the Buddha. I have reached the conviction, he said, that human suffering must be comprehended. The Buddha's answer to the perennial question was simple and typically Indian. It is attachment to the senses and to material desires, he said, which is the root of all human unhappiness. Get rid of those desires and you'll find the path to salvation.
The period of the Buddha's lifetime, from the 6th to the 5th century BC, has been called the Axis Age, because so many of the great thinkers in world history were alive at the same time. The Buddha and Mahavira in India, Pythagoras and the early Greek philosophers, the greatest of the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah, Confucius, Lao Tzu and the Taoists in China, and even some have thought Zoroaster in Persia. It's extraordinary to think that many of those people could actually have met each other. It suggests that the ancient world, which had emerged from the first civilizations of Iraq and Egypt, China and India, was undergoing a crisis of spirit, but also a crisis of opportunity. Fundamental questions were being asked about the nature of God, about the meaningfulness of life on earth, and about the basis of the authority for kings and states. And at the heart of that, the question which still plagues governments even today in the United States and the Soviet Union. How do you persuade your citizens to act as moral beings? How do you persuade them to be good? The different ways in which those civilizations attempted to come to terms with these questions still shape them and us today. The Near East took the path of monotheism, which would become central to the ideology of the West as well as Islam. China, the Confucian conception of the individual, the family and the state in a perfectible moral order on earth. Whereas in India, the great tradition asserted that this earthly material life is simply illusion and that true enlightenment can only come by forsaking it, the absolute opposite of the Western ideology. And so the social and economic character of these great cultural blocs is still shaped by that revolutionary epoch even today.
The Khyber Pass on the northwest frontier, a battleground for millennia. Here the Aryans had entered India, the first great wave of invaders. And in 326 BC, Alexander the Great's armies poured across the Khyber into India, the first great clash between East and West. But only decades later, an Indian Buddhist emperor set up inscriptions here in the Khyber, recording the first attempt to impose a political unity on India. This was the Mauryan Empire and the emperor, the great Ashoka. Little known outside his own country, Ashoka was one of the most remarkable people in world history. His story can be pieced together in his own words from inscriptions on stone columns, like this one at Kosambi, still today an object of veneration for Buddhist pilgrims. It was after a victorious war in which he killed 100,000 people that Ashoka became convinced that war was wrong. Then he developed the idea which would echo across the ages right down to Mahatma Gandhi: ahimsa, non-violence.
From now on, he said, I will try to conquer by right conduct alone. And then, all across India, columns like this were set up literally as pillars of morality in order to explain what this doctrine of right conduct, dharma, actually meant. Remarkably, it was not based on religion. It was a secular ideal of the dignity of human beings and the humanistic possibilities of civic morality. And in the clauses on these inscriptions appear all those words which modern politicians find so difficult to pronounce today: compassion, tolerance, gentleness, truthfulness. The clauses on non-violence abjure meat-eating and preserve a whole range of species, from the parrot to the rhinoceros. Forests, Ashoka says with prophetic force, must not be burned uselessly. In all this, and especially the ecology and the conservation measures, Ashoka sounds astonishingly modern to us today, perhaps misleadingly so, as he does in his wide-ranging social and welfare legislation. But so too in that bane of our time, massive state intervention, with an army of spies and thought police to check up on what people were doing. It sounds intolerable to us today, and no doubt it was to some people at the time too. But Ashoka is an extraordinary product of that extraordinary age, the Axis age, turning from the authority of religion and magic to that of reason and morality as a basis for politics. And however imperfectly he tried to execute it, his idea of Dharma, of right conduct, was one of the great ideas of human history, to set beside Greek democracy, the American Bill of Rights, the Communist Manifesto. And as one stands with the late 20th century world roaring around, one might be forgiven for thinking that this was an idea whose time is almost come.
Ashoka's ideals had responded to a deep current in Indian culture. Here in the southwest, Kerala has long been a cosmopolitan place, Chinese fishing nets lining its lagoons. From the 1st century AD, Mediterranean merchants, drawn by its wealth, flocked here on the monsoon winds, as in later times did Vasco da Gama and the Chinese admiral Zheng He. From ports like this, Cochin, Arab traders bore some of India's greatest scientific discoveries to the west, including her most brilliant invention, the mathematical system we all use today. But the real motive for the trade was spice. Here in Cochin, for centuries, foreign merchants bought the famed spices of the Malabar coast, especially pepper and ginger, which are both words from South India. Such contacts help breed an outward-looking and tolerant society, as it still is. Sail up the little rivers and creeks in the Cochin backwaters, and you'll come across communities which embody the Indian idea of civilization as pluralism. Tradition says the Jews came to this village from Iraq in the 6th century BC. Theirs must be one of the oldest and loveliest synagogues in the world. They're only one family now, carefully maintaining the rites as best they can. But recently local girls have converted to marry into the family, so they still hope their traditions will be passed on.